The name of the veteran is Eric Liederman. His birth date is January 20th, 1963. The war he served in was the Gulf War, and his branch of service was the U.S. Navy. The highest rank he achieved was Lieutenant Commander, and the address that this is taken at is 1400 East 8th Street, Davis, California. The date is November 19th, 2014. The name of the interviewee is Eric Liederman, and the interviewer is Ethan Liederman, his son. The other people present at this interview are Kara Vincent, Oliver Janata, and Javi Nieves. The interview is being conducted for the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress. Let me ask you, where and when were you born?
Los Angeles, California, January 20th, 1963.
What were your parents' occupations, and how many siblings did you have?
My father's a psychiatrist, and my mother was a sociologist. She had a number of different jobs. I have one brother, and I also have a half-sister.
What were you doing before you entered the service?
I was in college and in medical school.
Were there other family members who served in the military?
Yes, my father was in the Army. My grandfather was in the Navy. I think that's it.
Were you drafted, listed, or commissioned?
Commissioned.
Commissioned. Did you volunteer?
Yes.
Did you have to do boot camp?
Not really.
Do you remember arriving at your military after you commissioned when you first got there?
Yes.
What was it like?
Well, I had a medical school scholarship with the Navy, and so I was commissioned, and then I went to what they called Officer Indoctrination School, which is kind of like Officer Candidate School, except that everybody's actually already an officer. So it's more like camp. The idea is you have doctors and medical students and nurses and lawyers and those professionals who are, or in this case, naval officers, and the idea is to teach all of us how to be presentable, how to wear a uniform, who to salute back, where to wear your medals, and in what order, military protocol, sort of thing.
Did you see anyone that you knew before you went?
Well, I just went from medical school straight to Newport, Rhode Island for this officer indoctrination.
So there was no one that you knew prior to going?
Not there, no.
Okay. What were your specific duties?
My specific duties there at Officer Indoctrination School, or are we talking about?
I'm talking about still at the camp that you were talking about.
Oh, okay. Well, the duties were the ones I talked about a few minutes ago.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm. And then moving into actually being in the military service,
mm-hmm.
What was a typical day like for you?
Well, so as I said, I was a commissioned officer from being in medical school forward, and I went to Oakland at that time had a Navy hospital, and so I was a surgical intern there. And so, for a year, my job was to be a surgery intern, and learn surgery and do surgery. And then at the end of that year, I had signed up to be a Navy flight surgeon, but flight surgery school didn't start for me until late summer or early fall. I'm not sure exactly when. So I had some time, and then so I was sent for part of the summer to Nevada, naval base in Nevada, where I served as a physician for a while. And then I went to Florida for flight surgery school, and after that I was with my squadron in North Carolina for 3 years. So my daily life changed in each of these instances, and so when I was in training, my job was pretty much the same as any other doctor in training anywhere in the country. And then when I was doing this short-term assignment, I was just on this naval base in the middle of Nevada desert, and seeing patients in clinic and that sort of thing. And then when I was in flight surgery school, I was in classroom most of the time, or learning how to fly a helicopter. And that was all interesting. And then when I was with my squadron, I would have clinic hours. I'd spend time with the squadron, I'd work with a safety officer, deploy, and then of course to the Gulf War as well. So, the daily activities changed depending on where I was and when it was.
So besides your training, you had patients throughout the rest of your service?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have any memorable experiences with patients?
Well, yeah, when I was up in Nevada during this time when I was waiting to go to flight surgery school right after I finished my surgery internship, I had I think it was a gunnery sergeant come in, and he had a skin lesion on his chest, and so I, cut that out for him, and he was happy. I took care of that for him, and while I was doing that, I mentioned that I was interested in trying to get a sharpshooter medal, which you have to go to the shooting range and get a certain number of bullseyes. And so the next day he sent a couple of his corporals around with a jeep, and they took me to the firing range, and they practically held the rifle and the pistol for me. I mean, it was pretty easy. So I got those medals, but I can't say I'm particularly good at shooting.
And what apparel did you wear throughout your service? Did you switch between your surgeon's garbs and your military uniform, or how did that work?
Well, when I was in surgery internship, I would often wear scrubs, but I also wear my uniform at various times, And when I was, on base, I would always be in uniform, and on the ship, I sometimes wear I usually wear a flight suit, which is a full-length, kind of overalls, with patches and stuff. You've probably seen them in movies. And sometimes camouflage, depending on what we're doing, or, whites or khakis, different uniforms.
Okay, and did you live with people that were at equal level with you and who were also doctors?
Not also doctors. So on the ship, there were only 6 or 7 doctors out of many thousands, of people. A lot of folks on an aircraft carrier. So the people I was bunking with, I had 2 roommates. One was they're both Marines. So one was a Harrier pilot, and the other one was administrative officer. So they were similar rank to me. I mean, they were majors in the Marine Corps. I was a lieutenant, which is the same as a captain in the Marines. So pretty similar.
Did you have any bad experiences with any people on anywhere that you were?
Bad experiences?
People that you disliked, or people that any bad experiences at all?
Well, I had one interesting experience. So when I was on the aircraft carrier, deployed, to Gulf War, the commanding officer would make a habit of conducting weigh-ins for all of the enlisted men, there weren't any women, after holidays like Thanksgiving and Christmas and things like this, because the Marines have very strict weight requirements. It's different from the Navy, for instance. And they would never do this for the pilots, for the officers. And so this caused a lot of sort of, disgruntlement amongst the enlisted. I was vaguely aware of, I had working for me as Navy corpsmen. These are enlisted guys who really took care of a lot of the medical duties, especially in the field. But they would tell me about this. But anyway, I didn't think there was much I could do about it. One day, one of the pilots came down to me, a real nice guy, but about 30 pounds overweight, pretty obviously so. And he wanted to apply to jet school. He was a helicopter pilot. And so he needed my sign-off. And so I told him, well, I need to do a physical exam, and that includes, you need to weigh you. And so he was really overweight. And so I said, I can't sign this unless you lose this weight. But also, according to Marine Corps regulations, you're not eligible to fly now. So it gave him what was called a downshift, ultimately, the commanding officer decides who flies, but they almost never go against the advice of the flight surgeon, because if there's a aircraft mishap, their career is over. Right? So the commanding officer was just absolutely furious with me. He wanted to throw me off the ship, but it actually ended up going really well. So this guy who was overweight, this pilot, he hit the gym a couple times a day, pretty strict diet, and he actually was able to lose the weight in time to still get his application in jet school, and he was accepted. And when he got home, his wife was happy to see him because he looked really good, from her perspective. So it all ended up okay. But the interesting thing about it is I wasn't a Marine. I was in the Navy. The Marine Corps doesn't have doctors. So the Marine Corps is part of the Navy, and the Navy rules for pilots don't involve weight. You can be fat and you can fly if you're in the Navy, but you can't be fat and fly if you're in the Marines. So they were their rules. So it was interesting to me.
Okay. And I know I asked you if you had any bad relationships with any individuals, but do you have any good friends that you made while in the service?
Yes. I had a lot of good friends, amongst some other doctors, pilots, some officers on the ship, just you share experiences that are like that, it's good. It's also on the ship, it took us a month to get there and a month to get back. And on the way, we stopped at some nice places. We stopped at Majorca, the island of Majorca, on the way there, and in Egypt on the way back, and in Israel too. And so, had some interesting times. And plus, when we were in the Persian Gulf, we had a lot of time to explore. By the time we got there, the combat was over. It was a very short period of combat, and it took us so long to get there, a month, that it was actually over by the time we got there. So we spent a lot of time in port, exploring different places in the Persian Gulf.
So where was actually your favorite place to be out of all these places?
Well, that's interesting. They all had different value, Yeah, they're all fun in different ways. Yeah.
Okay. And did you keep in touch with these friends that you made?
Yeah, over the years I have. It's hard though. People go in their different directions. And when I got out of the military, I went into residency and then moved back to the West Coast. So it's been hard to stay in touch with everybody.
And along with these friends and other companions that you got on the ship, what was the treatment like for you specifically? Was it good living conditions? I know you described how you had 2 bunk beds, but did you have good food, and were the treatment that you had pretty adequate?
Well, yeah, everything's relative, so there's no absolutes in life, and people can get used to just about anything. But on the ship, space is at a premium, and junior enlisted guys lived, I thought, in pretty terrible conditions. Bunk beds stacked 5 high, and rooms 50 or 60 people. So somebody snoring could keep a lot of people up at night. And really almost no room at all to store their stuff. Maybe a small locker, and that was about it. In my situation, we actually had our own room, which was nice on the ship. And there were 3 of us in a room for 4 people, so with the 2 bunk beds, and we actually had 1 bunk bed not used, so we actually, between the 3 of us, we bought a fair number of Persian rugs and stored them there for the ride home. Also, my office was an operating room, or could be converted to an operating room if we needed it. So it was very spacious, and so I actually brought my bicycle with me, and on the ship, and so when we pull into these ports, I'd head off on the bike. Yeah.
Oh, great! So did you pick up on any recreational activity that you still do, besides biking?
Well, nothing new. By the way, the food was generally pretty good. It was okay, except at one stretch we were out at sea for 30 straight days, and we ran out of all the fresh food, and it got to be kind of tedious. And at the end of that, there's a Navy tradition that if you're out at sea for 30 days or more, then they have what's called a beer day, and they actually have beer on the ship. Normally there's no alcohol on the ship. So everybody got 2 beers. And that was a big problem for the doctors because not everybody would just drink 2 beers. There's a lot of trading going on. And so there were some people who found a way to get completely drunk and ended up in the, seeing us. So not too fun for us.
Not too fun.
Yeah.
And were there any memorable experiences there? With people being sent to you for being drunk, not just combat injuries?
No, that one wasn't memorable, but there were other times. So, for instance, aircraft carriers don't go out on their own. They have a squadron of ships around them, cruisers and destroyers and things like that, And the carrier was by far the largest, and of all these ships, of course. But and the only ship that had doctors on it, the other ships had one corpsman usually, and on one of these ships, with the destroyer, a bunch of the crew developed this eye disease, and so as the flight surgeon, I was the designated eye specialist, and I had very little training in this area, and so they sent him over to my ship by helicopter, and I did my best, but I didn't know what was going on here, and so I sent them to a hospital in Kuwait because we were off the coast of Kuwait, but Kuwait, was in pretty bad shape at that point because it's just after the war had ended, and they just recently kicked the Iraqis out, and but anyway, they came back with their notes, copies of their notes, because everything was paper, at that time. Copies of their notes all in Arabic, and eye drops with Arabic labels, and I had no idea what any of it said. Nobody on the ship could help me out with that either. So I said, well, how many times a day they tell you to use these drops? I said, okay, well, do that. There's not much else I could do, but they all cleared up. So I still, to this day, have no idea what's going on with these guys.
So you were on an aircraft carrier for the majority of the time, correct?
The whole time I was deployed, yeah,
okay.
To the Gulf War. Yeah.
And about how many other doctors were with you on the aircraft carrier?
Well, ultimately there were, I think, 6 or 7. But initially, what's supposed to happen is about 6 months before deployment, you're supposed to have all the doctors in place, and everybody's doing their thing, getting their units ready for deployment. Deployment's a big deal, and you have to meet certain readiness thresholds, including medical readiness, in order to deploy, and things like immunizations and physicals and various things like that. And so, in this case, it was a lot of doctors were already in the Persian Gulf, and so for the first few months it was just me rather than these other doctors. And I was the doctor for the squadron, but there was no doctor for the infantry or the command unit or these other groups, thousands of people spread out over hundreds of square miles. And so I basically had to drive around and make sure everything was happening. And so I devised essentially a clinical registry using software that I bought at a store, called Egghead software. This is back before the internet, so you had to buy everything in actual stores. And I had a portable computer that was not like a laptop that you guys are used to, but really big and heavy, and really slow. But it seemed at the time to be pretty fast. And I just drive around and collect the data that I wanted from them on what are called floppy disks. So this is before CDs, And so I'd collect all this stuff, and I was basically doing 5 or 6 doctors worth of work, and finally, in the month before, they finally got some other doctors. So I didn't actually work with anybody up until a few weeks before we left.
All right, so I know that you said that you had the computers that you carried around with you. Was there any other military technology that you were surprised by or that was really intriguing and interesting that you experienced in your service?
Well, Harrier jets are interesting. Do you guys know anything about that?
No,
okay. So a Harrier is an aircraft it's a jet aircraft, but it can take off and land vertically. So it can take off normally and it can land normally, but it can also, hover, right? And it doesn't have, unlike a helicopter, it has fixed wings, right? So it has these jets of, pushing down below it, right? And unfortunately, if there's have stiff wind, they can actually flip over. They're kind of unstable that way compared to helicopters. But that's what we had in so our aircraft carrier was a Marine Corps carrier, not a Navy carrier. So it didn't have F-14s and the kind of stuff you maybe think of when you think of a carrier. It had helicopters and these Harriers, and so the Harriers would take off the same way that you might have seen in movies, but they would land coming down like a helicopter, right? And then they would taxi, and park, right? And so that was just amazing. I mean, to watch these things do that, I mean, you have this ship that's moving around. Ships don't stay stable, they're just kind of moving back and forth, up and down, side to side, all of these things all at the same time, and at night, right? So it's amazing these guys could land safely.
Okay, and you said that the ship was really like moving back and forth. Was it hard to sleep and function on a normal day-to-day basis with living on a ship for that long?
Well, some people did have some problems with that. The smaller the ship, the more that bad weather would affect the people in the ship. So the aircraft carrier actually, we ran into a big storm in the Atlantic on our way back, and he was doing this sort of thing, right, back and forth, and that was pretty noticeable. But on one of on the smaller ships that were with us, they were just bobbing around like a cork, and one of them, the captain, was thrown out of his bunk even though he was belted into it, and so he decided that he'd had enough, and he headed north looking to get out of that storm. And a carrier, they're really big, and so we didn't have to deal with that. But it was still pretty noticeable. Also, my room was right below the flight deck, and so every time their takeoff and landing was pretty loud. So sleep was sometimes hard to get.
All right, so I see that it's difficult, but were there any actual injuries that you had to deal with based on this?
Luckily, very few. That was a war when there were very few injuries. There was some pretty near misses. Like one time, one of these Harriers, it landed and it taxied up to the bow, the front of the ship, to park, and the ship was moving side to side a lot, and so the front wheels ended up getting locked perpendicular. So the aircraft's nose is pointing this way, and the wheels are this way, and so the nose started doing this, and then the nose went over the railing. And the pilot was afraid that there was about to land in the water, and so he pulled the eject lever, and so he ejected straight up, and then his chute deployed, and he came straight down. Now the problem is that the ship's moving ahead full speed, right? And if you actually fall in the water, then you're going to get sucked in through the engines, and you're not going to make it out alive, right? So. He was lucky that his parachute caught on, in the bow there's some cannons, guns. So there's a 5-inch gun mount, and it landed on that. So he was dangling with his feet in the water, and so they pulled him up, And so they called him Teabag after that. But it's pretty funny. But if he'd just come down a few feet over to the side, then he would have been dead.
Oh, wow. Did you yourself have any close calls, if you mind me asking, while in the battle, or while in your service?
Well, I was never in any battles. I was lucky that way. So I didn't have close calls like that.
Although you did just describe not all injuries happen in battles, in
right.
the ship, and in other close calls as well. Just asking, were there, what was the majority of people? Was it young men typically on the ship?
Yeah, at that time, there were no women on ships. Well, on combat ships. There were women in the Navy on support ships, but not on combat ships. That's changed. It's different now.
Okay, and so what was the years that the war was, and the duration that you were in it?
Well, I remember very clearly when the war started. So I was coming back from my time in Nevada. I was there for a few weeks, as I mentioned earlier, in the summer of 1990. And on the news, everybody was watching CNN back then. It's all broadcast news and cable news. And so that Saddam Hussein of Iraq had invaded Kuwait, and then that President George H.W. Bush, the father of the President Bush that you are familiar with, he decided that the U.S. was going to go in and to go to war here, and so that was pretty scary because I hadn't really anticipated that I'd be in a war, right? I mean, the U.S. hadn't really been in a war since Vietnam, which ended in early mid-'70s, and so this was 15 years later, and there really hadn't been any war, and the U.S. wasn't interested in going to war. So it was the first one, right? And so that was pretty scary, to think about that. But so it started then, and we got there in, let's see, we got there at the end of 1991, and the combat was over by then.
Oh, wow.
So what they ended up doing was having it be mostly an air war. So they flew a lot of bombing runs for months, and then when they finally did the ground attack, it just lasted a few weeks.
Okay. What was your readjustment to civilian life after you came back from the war?
Well, it was really easy. I mean, being a physician, being a doctor is not that different, one or the other. I mean, just a matter of, military is different than civilian life in a number of ways. I mean, you wear a uniform, of course, you're on military bases, and so you're with military people, but also things that are not illegal in civilian life are illegal and can result in very serious consequences in the military. So, for example, if you're late to work, you're not going to be arrested, but you can be in the military. If you don't show up for work at all, like for instance, let's say your squadron deploys and you don't go with them, well, in civilian world, you'd probably get fired for that. But in the military world, you'd probably go to prison for that.
So when you came back from your service to civilian life, what was the experience like? Were you blown off an aircraft carrier, or how did you get back?
No. I mean, the war, I got back, from Desert Storm in early spring of 1992, right? There about 6 months, right? And so I was still in active duty until June, July of 1993. And so at that point, I just went through the various paperwork I had to do and just drove off.
Oh, wow.
Right.
And so when you got home, did you have any issues with linking again with your family and with your community?
No.
Not at all? And have you pursued contact with your fellow veterans since the war?
Yeah, sometimes.
Not so much then?
Not so much.
Okay. And now just asking you about some reflections.
Mm-hmm.
How did it actually affect your life in an overall spectrum, if you could take a step back and think about it? Do you think it's changed you at all as a person?
Yeah, I think so in some important ways. The military requires people to really push themselves to, and sometimes past, what they think their limits are. That can be done in a lot of different ways. I mean, you think about combat, and it's not just in combat. So, for instance, I mentioned that I was considered the eye specialist. On the ship, I was also the ear, nose, and throat specialist, and number of other things. And so, basically, I found myself, essentially alone. Remember, this is before the internet, and before cell phones, right? And so we're out there in the Persian Gulf, and the nearest military hospital is in Germany, right? So, U.S. military hospital. So, I had some people, and I needed, for instance, I had some of my pilots who were complaining of, pain in their face and their descent, and, I strongly suspected that they had chronic sinus conditions that might require surgery. But in order to determine that, I needed to get a CAT scan. But the nearest CAT scanner is in Germany, right? So I had to send them there. And it turned out there were 3 of these guys, and 2 of them I was right, and ended up getting surgery. Actually, one of them decided just not to fly anymore. He was a pretty marginal pilot anyway, so it was really his way to get out of it. He was probably going to get kicked out anyway, So this way he was face-saving. But, I mean, that... I had to really stretch myself way beyond what I normally would have to do in a more sort of normal environment with lots of support around me and lots of specialists and colleagues and other folks, So the other thing is that by having to go through this exercise of creating this, basically this whole computerized system for medical readiness and keeping track of everything at a time when none of that really existed. I just had to create it all from scratch. That ended up, helping me figure out what I want to do in my career later, which was to focus on that sort of thing.
All right, so looking back, would you say that you enjoyed your service?
Yeah, most of it, yeah.
Okay. And you're saying that it definitely benefited your life?
Yeah, and the other way is that, medical school is very, very expensive. I mean, it makes college look cheap, I guess, by comparison. And college is certainly not cheap. But, there's only a few ways to pay for medical school. You can have extremely rich parents or grandparents, which most people don't have. And I didn't have, money from my family to pay for medical school. Or you can borrow the money from the bank. The banks are happy to lend it to you. But generally speaking, people who do that end up with a lot of debt, a couple $100,000 in debt, no house, right? So you have a mortgage but no house, right? You have to pay it off, and it can take decades to pay that off. And in the meantime, you get out of school, you're trying to start a family, and you're still living in a one-bedroom apartment, and for a long time. It really can weigh on you. And then, so in my case, the military paid for everything in medical school, and actually paid me a small stipend, which was quite luxurious. I had, colleagues of mine in medical school who were borrowing everything, and they borrow money to buy pizza, basically. Imagine that, I mean, everything that they're spending money on, it was borrowed money, and so, you'd spend $15 on a pizza, but it's $15 plus, with the interest, you're probably doubling the cost, right? I mean, everything, right? And so, for me, I spent my time in the military, and I got out, and I was done, and I didn't have all of this debt hanging over me.
Oh, wow, so you're happy that you took the route that you did?
Yeah.
Okay. And would you say there's any life lessons to share with everyone else about your service in the military?
Well, I think a lot of people don't give themselves or find themselves in opportunities to really see what they are capable of. Most people live within their comfort zone. And I think it's important to be in situations where you're pushed out of your comfort zone and actually can find out what you're really capable of doing. The military does that out of necessity. I mean, it can't send all the support structures and everything that we take for granted here in the United States out into a military campaign. So everybody's got to do as much as they possibly can, and oftentimes more. And doing that helps everybody, I think. It certainly helped me figure out that I was actually capable of putting up with a lot more than I thought I could, and doing a lot more than I thought I could, and figuring out things that I never would have thought that I could figure out how to do. And also, helped me understand how to work within kind of strange systems. So, for example, in the military, it seems from the outside to be very rigid, lots of rules, everything's set, the ranks and all this stuff. But in fact, to get anything done, you oftentimes just have to, do a bunch of horse trading and just figure stuff out. And oftentimes, it's best not to ask too many questions. So I had my senior corpsman, really good guy, and we would need something, and he'd say, "Well, I'll take care of that, Doc, but no questions asked, right?" And right, got it. And he'd just be able to come up with stuff. Or another time, we were on the ship, and there's actually three groups of people on the ship. You have the junior enlisted guys who don't live too well, and you have the officers. But the people who actually have the best life on the ship are the senior enlisted, like chiefs and gunnery sergeants and master sergeants. These people, they really, these guys have paid their dues. They live the best. They have the best food for sure. And I wanted to take care of my guys, and so my corpsmen, and so got an arrangement where I was the only person on the ship who could order those gold aviator glasses you're probably familiar with, right? So there were only two kinds, at least at that time, there were only two kinds of glasses you could get ordered from the Navy. The gold aviator glasses for aviators, and everybody else got these thick black framed glasses, which pretty unattractive, and so nobody wanted those. So we had some of the senior enlisted guys on the ship, these senior chiefs, master chiefs come in, and I ordered them and got them their aviator glasses, and they made sure to take care of my guys and got them good food. So that was good.
Oh, wow, so there's actually a lot of bartering when you were in the service.
Yeah, everybody's got a little something that they can trade.
So you think that that itself gets carried over here? You actually found a way to actually communicate with other people better and understand what other people need, and has that actually helped you?
Yeah, I mean, what it helped me understand is that sometimes things that I have that are really of no value to me personally, or I just take for granted, are extremely valuable to somebody else, and vice versa, and we could probably figure out a mutually beneficial arrangement.
So you would recommend the military service to everyone because you think that it was beneficial for you and for everybody?
Well, I don't know. I mean, people have to make their own decisions, you know. I mean, I don't know if it's right for everybody. I think something similar to the military in terms of this, what I talked about a few minutes ago, is probably useful for everybody. Maybe it could be the Peace Corps for somebody, you know. It could be something within the United States, like the VISTA program, you know. Maybe it's Outward Bound. I don't know, you know. But something that takes you out of your comfort zone, puts you in a situation where you don't have all of the support and the luxuries and comforts that you're used to, where you have to push yourself beyond where you think you are capable of, and actually accomplish it.
So I know I asked you if it was harder to come back to life away from all the rigid rules, but it actually sounds like it might have been easier as it emotionally strengthened you in your service. It might have it maybe improved you as a human being when you came back to regular life.
Yeah, the other thing is, what I was able to do in the Navy is I was able to figure out pretty quickly how things really worked by spending a lot of time talking to people who'd been in a while. And I actually wrote a manual for my colleagues about how to actually get things done in the military, especially in the Navy. And, you know, because you don't want to violate the rules in the military. There can be very serious consequences for violating the rules. But there's a lot of leeway to operate within the rules. So, for example, the military, like the government, operates on a fiscal year funding cycle. So they go from October 1st to September 30th, right? That's the military and the federal, you know, cycle. So basically, the way things work in the government, unfortunately, is that if you're a unit, you have a budget, and you don't spend your money this year, then they're going to give you less next year, right? So it turns out there's this perverse incentive to spend your entire budget. But on the other hand, you don't want to spend your budget you don't want to end up spending all your money before the end of the year. And so people tend to be conservative in the first half to 3/4 of the year, and then they start looking for opportunities to unload the money. And then in the last month of the year, which is September, they just give it away. I mean, they just get rid of that money, right? So it took me a while to figure out what the implications were of this. A friend of mine who was another doctor, he seemed to be always going on these great vacations, and it was all, you know, medical education, right? So he'd go to Jamaica and do a surf medicine conference, you know, in September, right? And it was always September. I said, "What's going on?" You know, and I said, "Well, you know, I just should go talk to everybody, all the finance officers, and say, hey, you got any extra money?" You know, and I always go in August or September, and they say, "Yeah," and I just go on these trips.
Did you ever take advantage in this way?
You know, by the time I figured it out, I don't know if I had time. Maybe I did it once, you know, but he'd really figured it out early. So, you know, it's important to understand what is driving everybody's agenda, what the structural things are that are happening, and and this has really helped me in my job now. Whenever I encounter strange behavior by people or by organizations, I just start digging and try to figure out how the money flows, and it almost always explains to me what's going on. And if you understand what's going on, then you can predict what's going to happen. And if you can predict what's going to happen, then you can change what you're going to do to accommodate it, or you can try to make changes to their incentives so that things happen the way you need them to happen. But if you just try to harangue people who are basically doing something from their standpoint that's completely logical, then, you know, you're just it's like yelling into the wind.
Okay. And did anything actually, before you did your service, prepare you beforehand?
Closest thing probably was I did Outward Bound, two different Outward Bound programs. That was probably the closest.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Thank you for this interview, and thank you for your service.
Right, thank you. Right. Good, guys.